Good afternoon, and I hope that you're doing okay. I wanted to take the time to give you a couple updates related to the course and then to get into this week's content related to the connection between space, place, and listening more broadly. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, I wanted to apologize for the delay in getting stuff up for this week. As I shared on Monday, I was involved in a pretty serious car accident, which my car skidded out of control and rolled upside down. Thankfully, we had a medical examination and my dog and I are fine. But because that happened on Monday and I've been trying to coordinate travel and getting back home ever since, it has put a little bit of a delay on getting things back to you and getting this week's content up. So I apologize for that. To compensate for that, I want to push things back a week to make things easier for you. So I have this week's essay for essay number 2. The prompt is available, as well as the week 8 quiz. But rather than have them due this Sunday, I'm pushing them back a week and not having them due until Sunday, March 6th. That should give you plenty of time to work on and develop that, and also will give you the chance to return your grades and feedback on those earlier assignments to help prepare you for working on that. So again, I apologize for the delay, and I wanted to make sure to give you a good window to work on those things with that in mind. So let's go ahead and get started on this week's reading, which comes from Peak, which is concerned with the question, how do space and place impact listening? We've been talking a lot over the course of the quarter about some of the ways in which listening is shaped by things such as culture, gender, colonialism, race, and so on. But it's also important for us to situate those things in terms of physical location and how location doesn't just impact listening in terms of noise, but also in terms of the cultural significance and impact that we attach to particular locations too. So we'll be situating some of those issues, and then we'll also be exploring these ideas of soundscapes and the ways in which listening is shaped by elements of location. Like last time, I'll use the slides to help to gain some context and understanding that I think will help you in approaching this week's readings. I know that the reading might be a little bit challenging in some of the content that it goes over, but try to focus on some of the key points and findings and the ways that this reading deals with the idea of listening more broadly. This week's reading comes from Dr. Bryce Peak, who's an assistant professor of communication at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and comes from a background previously as a graduate student at the University of Oregon that is closely connected to issues of listening, engaging in listening as it relates to physical location and surroundings. So comes in with a lot of background that I think will help us to understand listening in the context of location. So the key thesis, an idea that comes from this week's article, is the idea that listening is an active process. It's one that's shaped by things like culture and power that impact the ways that we participate and engage with one another. That is, we need to think about context or the situation in which listening occurs, whether it's an urban setting, a busy coffee shop, or somewhere that's very quiet. And also the way that power implicates that process too, and constructs this idea of this location in which sound is happening and listening is taking place. That listening doesn't occur in a void, right? It occurs in this active, breathing, living location that's shaped by culture, context, and history. So as kind of a guiding principle to help us to understand the key ideas, I think it's important for us to differentiate space and place when we're talking about these things. Space is generally more of a kind of defined and more geographical way of thinking about location. So for instance, if you think about the border between Oregon and Washington, much of that border, right, is through the Columbia River, and that is the use of a physical boundary that is separating land masses and is creating that physical space and distancing. You might also think about the way that there's the use of canyons, mountain ranges, oceans, and other physical indicators that are defining those boundaries. So space is generally referring more to the physical stuff, the things that are there and present. You might think about outer space, right, and the way that that type of vast, empty expanse is characterized physically. Whereas place is much more concerned with the cultural meaning and cultural significance that's associated. So you might be thinking, for instance, about a coffee shop that you like to go to. The coffee shop is a space, right? It's a physical location in which there's this building, but its place might be that it's Joe's coffee shop that's family owned and it's a lively place to catch up with people, right? So place is much more concerned with the significance and meaning that we in cultures have assigned to that location. So in looking at the borders between a lot of states that, are fairly square, right? Suddenly you're driving down south past Ashland, and suddenly you're in California, right? And that's much more about place because it's not defined by a physical border, but instead a border that we've constructed that is separating out those locations. Additionally, an important consideration, one you might be familiar with if you're taking a course related to history or sociology, is the idea of colonialism, right? And colonialism draws from the ways in which, through kind of this sequential process, right, a country or sovereign nation acquires a political or social control of a location that is typically occupied. Again, you might think about the United States, westward expansion, and the sort of narrative of manifest destiny. You might think about British colonialism and the sort of expansion into a lot of locations, including India, right? The idea of occupying with settlers and then expanding sort of economically to serve the interests of the settler. Right? So colonialism is an important addition that provides context into some of the problems and things going on in the listening process in this week's case study. So it's a useful consideration for us to have. In addition to that, I think it's important for us to situate this idea of post-colonialism, that not only has colonialism impacted where we are now, but that we in many situations live in post-colonialism, where colonialism might not be currently going on or currently practiced. Maybe a colonizer withdrew or the land changed, but as a result of that, and sort of reverberations are still there. So, even though a country is sovereign or is no longer being colonized, that it was culturally, socially, and economically impacted by that process. So its aftermath is important. If we think about indigenous populations in the United States, who, many of whom might be living in reservations or designated spaces, right? That has been impacted by that process of colonialism. So it's important for us to situate that as well when we're understanding some of the ways that listening is happening and talked about in this week's reading. Another key idea that comes from Peake is this idea of a soundscape. If you think about a landscape, right, you're thinking about, the sky, the mountains, the lakes, the trees, all the things that sort of come together in different layers to make this entire geographic mass be depicted through an image. And in the same way, you can think about the soundscape as this combination of elements that get together. You might be thinking, for instance, about when you're walking down a busy street. For instance, I was in Portland last weekend, and while I was there, there was all the hustle and bustle of downtown. There were cars that were honking. There were people that were walking by and chatting with each other. There was somebody that was asking me for change. There's so many sounds that are going on together that are in many ways associated with that physical location, with that place, that form that overall soundscape. So that's an important thing that Peake brings to the table as well, is thinking about how a soundscape is impacting communication. Another idea that you might be familiar with if you've taken a course like me, communication theory, is this idea of media ecology theory. That suggests that media that we use is sort of an extension of ourselves. It's an extension of the environment and what we do every day. A good example is that in recent years, I've seen more and more when people go to a restaurant, they'll typically have their phone, face down on the table as they're eating and talking with each other. That we use media as a way of, regularly getting notifications, texts, updates. We use other devices like laptops on a regular basis as well. We talk to our friends about our Wordle scores. We are constantly using media as a way to connect and reinforce those connections with other people. And so it helps us to consider environment and its relationship to media too. So this week's reading gets into the very small space known as Gibraltar, which is a small occupied territory. So this is actually one that has a British occupation, including British military bases. And I think the interesting thing to kind of follow along with and pay attention to in this week's reading is how the cultural practices, the sort of native populations of the area, express and behave and create an environment that is listenable. They create a sort of soundscape, but also that the impacts of British colonialism essentially are creating a narrative or a filter or representation of what's occurring there. That the portrayal of, for instance, indigenous groups as savages by colonialism serves as a narrative to sort of deny the ways in which sounds, experiences, and perspectives are being shared and offered. So I share this to offer a little bit of context about the physical location in which this is happening and some of the tensions that are ongoing there. So I think this is useful as we think about some of the challenges that are happening here, about how we're interpreting or making sense of this space, this soundscape, and the ways that listening is occurring. So that's the main focus for this article. And I think this context will help as you're working through and trying to gather some of the key points here. So to wrap up for this week, we've talked about this idea of soundscapes, the ways in which this location is shaping our understanding of experience. We've talked about how listening is shaped by factors including our social relationships, by colonialism, and so on, and also how listening involves how we're negotiating with meaning and significance as we're engaging in some of those spaces too. So I think that'll be helpful as you work on this week's reading and start to think about some of these ideas. So for next week, we will be looking at what makes listening accessible. Knowing that listening is this active and involved and sensory process, of course, we need to consider some of the ways in which accessibility needs need to be situated within that broader conversation. So I look forward to us getting into more detail there and discussing that next week. Have a great rest of your week. Let me know if you have any questions and need any additional support. And I look forward to talking with you more soon.